I'm going to ask 100 authors for advice on how to write a book. I did not think they would reply. Because I've always wanted to write one, but it just feels like an impossible task.
Well, that's just great.
So I'm going to DM 100 authors who have been there and done it and ask them for any tips, any advice to help us, who I'm assuming you haven't written a book either, maybe you have, help us get there. Starting with George R.R. Martin.
Well, funny you should ask.
George R.R. Martin doesn't have Instagram, so starting with John Green. Dear John, little book pun there. What advice would you give to an aspiring author? Help me give my writing the green light. Send. Victoria Aveyard, author of the Red Queen series. Victoria, Red Queen was fantastic. I'd like to write a book that gets Red Queen. Please give me some advice on how to do that. These will be punny. Fair warning. Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson series. Rick, you are a god of writing. Please claim me as your kin and give me any advice on writing my first book. Sarah J. Maas, who wrote A Court of Thorns and Roses and a bunch of other great books. I've heard they're great, I've not actually read them myself. Shh. Sarah, I've read and loved every single one of your books. Do you have any tips on how I might successfully write my own book and get it published? Zen. Alexandra Bracken, who wrote the book Law, which is genuinely one of my favourite books. Although don't make the mistake that I made and read the whole thing thinking there's going to be a sequel because it's standalone. Law needs a sequel. Please write one. Also, I'd love to be a writer. Do you have any tips? Stephanie Meyer, who wrote Twilight. I'd love to be a vampire, but failing that, an author would be nice. Do you have any advice on how to write my first book? I actually don't think this is the right Stephanie Meyer. It is not. This is a coach, personal chef, and instructor. Maybe she'll have some advice. Brandon Sanderson, who wrote the Mistborn series, the Stormlight Archives, apparently the best living fantasy writer there is. I haven't read a lot of his stuff yet, but I own quite a lot of it with the intention of reading it.
Everything that guy just says. Thank you.
Brandon, your world building is fantastic. I'd like to build a world in which I am a successful author. Do you have any advice as to how I can make that happen? Colleen Hoover, who wrote It Ends With Us. It Ends With Us was fantastic. You're a fabulous writer. Do you have any tips for an aspiring author? I couldn't think of any puns. I haven't read her books, so kind of hard to think of anything. I should have done Hoover. My writing sucks, because like a Hoover, a vacuum, a Hoover. How can it suck less? I'm such an idiot. Veronica Roth, who wrote the Divergent series. Divergent was the first book that I stayed up all night reading. I was obsessed. I'd love to be a writer. Do you have any tips? That's actually true. It's the first time that I stayed up from literally nighttime until the next morning and didn't sleep because I was obsessed with the book. So we're being genuine for this one. No puns here. Cassandra Clare, who wrote the Shadowhunter series. Before we ask for the writing advice, there is a question I really want to ask Cassandra. Did you like the movie or TV show version of City of Bones better? It's important we find these things out. Also, I'd love to write as well as you. Do you have any advice? Michelle Obama, who wrote Becoming, and less famously was the First Lady when Barack Obama was president, but, you know, writer in her own right. First Lady, first author I ever read, first person I wanted to ask advice in becoming a writer. Do you have any tips? Don't go telling her that she wasn't actually the first person I asked, okay? I'm sure that will upset former First Lady Michelle Obama. Hank Green of TikTok fame, he also wrote an absolutely remarkable thing. Okay, it sounds like I'm describing something I really, really loved. It's the name of the book. I haven't read it. But again, I think I have it on the shelf up here somewhere. Yup, just here. Hank, I'm not saying You're a better writer than your brother? I wouldn't know, I haven't read his book. But you are the one I'm asking for advice. I also asked his brother, but shh. This video should be called Lying to 100 Authors. I'd love to be a writer. Do you have any tips? DFTBA? Some old school nerd fighter talk. Okay, 15 down, let's fly through some more. John Krakauer, who wrote Into the Wild. John, I'm a writer out here in the wild. Do you have any tips on how to be a better writer or how to get published? Susan Dennard, who wrote the Witchland series. Your books are magical. Do you have any advice for an aspiring author? Elizabeth Acevedo, who wrote The Poet X. You're an ace writer. Do you have any tips for somebody who wants to write a book? Glennon Doyle, who wrote Untamed. I love your books. My writing feels too tame. Any advice on how to free it and become a better author? Marie Lu, who wrote Legend. You are a legend of a writer. I'd love it if you had any advice for somebody who wanted to write their first book. Gail Foreman, who wrote If I Stay. If I stay writing books, I'd love any advice you might be able to give me to get better at it. Neil Gaiman, who wrote American Gods, the Sandman series. Neil, I've loved everything of yours that I've ever read. Do you have any advice for an aspiring author? I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but I have loved what I have read, which is the first half of the American Gods novel, and the blurb for The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I have lots of his books on these shelves, just, I'm not good at reading, but I'm good at buying books. I'm good at reading them, okay? Miley Cyrus, who you might be thinking, she's not an author, she's a singer and an actress. What is she doing on this Oh, what's this? One of the greatest pieces of modern literature. Miles to Go, an autobiography written while Miley Cyrus was still a teenager, with quirky little annotations in the margins. I'm sure there wasn't much control from Disney when she wrote this. Miley, you're a great singer, fantastic actress, but I must say that Miles to Go is the piece of work you've released that inspired me most. I'd love to become a writer. Do you have any advice? Should I just put on a blonde wig and take on a famous writer as an alter ego? Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale is a phenomenal piece of writing. I'd like to hand make a successful book myself someday. Do you have any advice? Leigh Bardugo, who wrote Shadow and Bone. Shadow and Bone was a fantastic piece of literature. Do you have any advice for an aspiring writer to bring their talents out of the shadows and finish that elusive first book? David Walliams, who has written a bunch of kids' books, including Gangster Granny. For David, I'm in awe of your versatility. Little Britain, Britain's Got Talent, and your writing. I would love to have even a drop of that success. Any advice on how I can turn my writing from 3 no's to a golden buzzer? A little bit of Britain's Got Talent humour for you there.
Give you a big juicy yes.
Cecilia Ahern, who wrote P.S. I Love You and my personal favourite book, Where Rainbows End. I put Cecilia, Where Rainbows End is my absolute favourite book ever. If you have any advice for an aspiring author, I'd be grateful to hear it. Genuinely, it is my favourite book. We are going sincere with Cecilia. Dan Brown, who wrote The Da Vinci Code. I put Dan. So many of your books are about uncovering secrets. Do you have any secrets to becoming a successful writer that you can share? Neil Schusterman, who wrote the Scythe series. I put Neil, Scythe was phenomenal. I actually made a TikTok about how much I loved it recently and it got almost 2 million views, which is correct. And it was linked to TikTok Shop and it sold like 500-600 copies of the book. So I feel like Neil owes me here. I was wondering if you might have any advice you could share with an aspiring author. Now, a lot of these authors are very successful, very famous, so I wasn't confident I would get many replies, but I had a trick up my sleeve for that. Like every good author, there is a plot twist in this story. There are a few successful authors that I know on a semi-personal level. For example, Robin Schneider, who wrote Extraordinary Means and Severed Heads, Broken Hearts. We had a mutual friend, my friend Alexa, and one time many years ago, me, Alexa, and Robin got brunch. I would be very surprised if she remembered, but she's actually a fantastic author, and if you haven't read these, I recommend them. So in an attempt to jog her memory, I've put, Robin, I don't know if you remember me, but we got brunch with Alexa years ago. I'm compiling a bunch of advice from successful authors, so if you have any tips from finishing your first draft of your first book to finding a publisher, I'd love to hear from you. We won't be as obnoxious and punny with the ones we know a little bit. Ben Alderson, who wrote Cloaked in Shadow, as well as a bunch of other books with fantastic LGBT characters. Ben and I have known each other for years, so I'm hoping he'll reply. I've put, Ben, I hope you're good. I'm compiling a bunch of advice from successful authors to share with aspiring writers. Do you have any tips that you can share from your own writing journey? And finally, my friend Christine, who I've known for absolutely years. She wrote Again But Better, and I would say she's maybe the only person on the internet who likes Lost more than I do. She's a fantastic writer, a wonderful person, and hopefully she will give me some advice. I've put Hey, Pole and Bananas, that was her YouTube channel. I'm compiling a bunch of advice from successful authors, and you absolutely fit that category. She will compliment in there to convince her to reply to me. Do you have any tips you might share with aspiring writers? Okay, 100 authors have been DM'd. We're now gonna wait a little while and see if we get any responses.
And now we wait. But for how long?
As long as it takes.
Okay, it's been about a week and a half. We have given plenty of time for these very busy authors to give us some responses. And we had some, which is better than I really expected, honestly. So the first reply I had was from my dear friend Christine, and the advice she gives is to write the story that you would be obsessed with. You've got so much time to spend working on the same story, so it has to be one that you are super excited about. Otherwise, you're not going to stick with it long enough to write the book. Don't write something to try and fit a trend. Write what you want to read. Which is great advice, honestly. I'm saying that as though I have any right to judge her. Successful author, person making a video having never written a book before. But it's true, I have started so many books in my life, and I don't think I've ever even gotten halfway through them. And I think it's because I often want to write because I want to write, not because there's a specific story or idea that I like obsess over. Love that, Christine, thank you so much for replying. I actually think she has a new book coming out very soon, which is like a romance about two characters who are on a reality TV show like Survivor, and they're like forced to be like chained together or something. I don't know the ins and outs, but it sounds really cool. Also, her last two books are wonderful, particularly Again But Better. I absolutely loved it, so if you haven't read that, I recommend it. The next person who replied is my friend Ben. So here's Ben's advice. Remember that writing is not a race. Take your time and always look ahead. Treat each draft as another layer of the human body. The first is the bones, the bare story, then you can go back and add the veins, the muscles, the skin, and the features. That's such a fun metaphor. Again, as someone who's never finished writing a book, that is definitely something I get bogged down in. I want everything in the first draft. All the nuance and the foreshadowing. I want my characters to be like super well fleshed out. But I guess if you just get the skeleton down and then you come back and add all of that detail later, you got way more to work with. Again, fabulous advice. Reply number 3 came from Robin Schneider. I don't know if you remember me saying that she and I got brunch a long time ago and I didn't expect her to remember who I was, but she did. I guess I'm memorable, unlike what my year 6 teacher Mrs. Hopkins used to tell me. So Robin, rather than giving me a single tip, actually sent me an article she'd written a little while back with 5 great pieces of advice. If you want to read the whole thing, I'll leave the link in the description. But essentially, Robin says to write a practice novel or two, which will teach you how to like pace a book, what your strengths and weaknesses in terms of like themes are, and once you've got those practice books out the way, the main one will be much easier. Which I guess is helpful advice, because if you have an idea that you absolutely love and really want to bring to life, you don't want to waste your big idea on like a practice novel that's going to have all these like flaws and holes in it before you've like perfected your craft. Like if I get excited about an idea, I never thought about that, but that's quite interesting. The next tip is to read your favorite books critically. So as you're reading through it, ask yourself what you like about the characters, what's done well about the world building, and then you can ask yourself like structural questions and stuff like that. You hear a lot of filmmakers talk critically about the films they consume, how the scenes are blocked and constructed and lit. And maybe I just don't consume as much media from authors, but you don't hear so much of that about writing and reading. So that's a really interesting point. Outlining 5 or 6 major plot points before you start writing. That way you'll never hit like a brick wall, you're always writing towards something. Read everything you can about the publishing industry. That's important. When I went to university, I did a literature and film degree, and they told us that most publishers will not pick up a manuscript unless it's come from somebody with a literary agent, which is just something I would never have had any clue about before. That was a little while ago, the landscape might have changed a little bit more. There's obviously more self-publishing options available now, but educating yourself about the industry side of things, definitely helpful. Robin also says that social media can be a distraction, but as someone who makes content on social media, we're gonna glaze over that and try not to take it personally. I'm so glad that Robin replied, because low-key she is one of my favorite authors. If you like John Green novels, and these Robin Schneider books are definitely gonna be something you'll enjoy. They're wholesome, they're a little bit pretentious, character-driven, and they're relatable, but also a little bit quirky. Big fan. Recommend Robin's books highly. Oh my god, I can't believe this person replied. This is actually the final response we got from any of the authors. A lot of the big ones just ignored me. But what have I told you? Stephanie Meyer replied. If you cast your minds back to earlier in the video, it's not this Stephanie Meyer. I sent it to the wrong person. But she genuinely gives me great advice. She says, I have no desire to live forever or drink blood, or really any interest in vampires at all. I know I'm in the minority. Stephanie Meyer, your sense of humour is fabulous. She says, so I didn't write Twilight, but I did write a few cookbooks, and my advice is to come up with an idea and just start writing. Just go for it. That's really it, and good luck. Firstly, knowing that I messaged her thinking she was the author of Twilight. She knew that and she still replied. What a fabulous sport and what great advice. So that's the advice that we received from the authors who replied. If you have experience writing and you have any tips to share, from corporate blog posts to fan fiction, please do leave any more tips that you have down in the comments. And if you ever wondered what the worst rated books on the internet were like, including far right propaganda, well, in this video I read the 5 worst rated books on Goodreads, and I like to think I gave them a fair crack, so you might want to check that one out next.